Let's get into it. Coach Colin here. Now, what we're talking about today is two clips. Tucker Carlson interviewed someone named Neil Oliver and Glenn Greenwald. Now, Neil is from Scotland. It's where he resides. Glenn Greenwald is American, but he lives in Brazil. Both of them have this interesting insight. Very far away from each other, but can still see the same things forming. And I think you can see it too if you're broadening your scope a little worldwide. Now, Charlie Kirk once talked about, after October 7th, he spoke about how his friend who is in the Israeli army was talking about how the same problem that you have with the left, he was saying to Charlie, we have in Israel. And then you hear, then you see what's going on in Canada and their problem with the left, their problem with Trudeau and all the terrible things he's doing. Then you see America, their issue with the left. And it's all the same stuff. It's all the wokeness. It's all the inclusivity. It's all the demonization of anything that is family, that is human, that is law, that is order. And you're not just seeing it in those places I named. You're also seeing it happening in Ireland, where there's politicians talking about restricting freedom as their job. There's a woman who said that. It seems to be that the left, or whoever is infiltrated, they all have the same agenda. Now, I link that to the World Economic Forum because a lot of these things that they're doing lines up pretty well with Agenda 2030, and that's something that's being orchestrated or at least planned by Klaus Schwab, now whoever his successor is going to be, now that he has stepped down from that role. But I just want to show you these two clips and how they're talking about the governments of the world kind of being synchronized in certain things that they're putting together. I'm sure that you've seen it if you have heard of any news outside of the United States of America. Brazil as well. Let's get into it. Neil Oliver first.
So you have in the SNP in Scotland people who are drunk with the idea of power. You know, they really, I mean, the very idea that a majority would have put that bunch actually in control of an independent country makes my blood run cold, because it was a close run thing for a while. But it's gone now. The threat's gone for a generation, if not forever. But so they're inept, they're cacistocratic, and when it came to the hate crime legislation, they just seem to go for one offensive, irritating policy after another. They attempted a named persons bill in recent history where they were trying to insinuate between every child and their parents a named person. Now, that could be a teacher, or it could be any figure. That person would have been encouraged, and the child would have been encouraged to establish a relationship with that named person. If there are things you don't want to talk to mum and dad about, you could talk to this named person, and your parents would never need to know that those conversations had taken place. This was the named persons bill. It was eventually knocked back at the Supreme.
But this is an attempt to destroy the family.
Yeah, well, that was my interpretation of it. And
what's the other interpretation?
Well, it was supposed to be
the government has more authority in your home than you do.
It's the same reason for clamping down on the internet. It's for the safety of children. That's what they always say. This it's about protecting children from this, that, and the other. And of course, we know it's got nothing to do with that. It's just about taking control of the internet. So the Named Persons Act was but in line with that idea of if you want to lead a popular movement, you have to separate the children from their parents. You've got to put pressure on the family until the family fractures. It took the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, to finally turn back and stop the Named Persons bill, but it'll be in someone's drawer somewhere, still under consideration. The hate crime legislation was just so it's important, not to come in on the SNP in the third act, so to speak. They've got a long history of this kind of behaviour, and when it came to the hate crime legislation, that was a pet project of Humza Yousaf, who was the sometime Justice Minister. He always failed in every post, but fell upwards. So he was justice and failed and got promoted up to health and failed and was promoted up to whatever, one inappropriate appointment after another. And the hate crime legislation was very much something that he championed.
And what was it?
It was well, you see this a manifestation of it in Canada. Trudeau has brought in similar legislation. I don't know if it's called the hate crime. It's almost the same name, but you see it all over. The same thing is happening in Australia. The attempt by these tin pot dictatorial politicians to have control of what people say and what people think. Hamza Yusuf wanted to criminalise what people were saying in the privacy of their own homes. So the idea was that if mum and dad were having a conversation in front of the television one evening and dad said something, if the child inadvertently repeated it in school the next day, let's say, my dad said so-and-so, the police could come to the house, hypothetically, and say to the father, what was that you were saying in this house last night? We've got, your child. That was the level of it.
So is Hamza? I mean, that's totally North Korean. I don't even think that happens in North Korea. Actually,
he's gone now.
But is he considered? I mean, he should be expelled from your country for doing that, in my opinion. But what is he considered a villain? I mean, how can he? That's so evil.
Yes, you would think that any rational person would respond to that kind of notion in the same way. But look at the way it's happening all over. It's not just happening in Scotland; it's happening all over. It's part of a pattern of behaviour of a certain kind of controlled leader in one Western country after another, who are demonstrably working from the same script. It's no coincidence that all of these Western regimes in these countries are taking similar steps at the same time. They're not acting independently of one another. They're not all having these dreadful ideas independently at the same time. No. This stuff is it's part of the same pattern that we saw during lockdown, where suddenly it was everyone was saying build back better, everyone was saying narrow window of opportunity.
Very, very true. Very, very true. Not a coincidence that they're all having the same terrible ideas at the same time. Fracturing of families, dismissing of the nuclear family, embracing a way of life that would make it so you cannot have a family per se. I'll just leave it there. But very, very interesting stuff from Neil Oliver. Definitely check out that interview. It's a long one. 2 hours, but it's great. The guy has a lot to say. Tucker Carlson asked some great questions. Now, Glenn Greenwald. First off, I just want to touch on that Named Persons Act, right? The fact that you could have these private conversations as a young person at school with a teacher per se. Same thing in the U.S. Hey, I heard, we've heard about this time and time again. It's probably still going on, but if there was a kid who wanted to use certain pronouns and had not told their parents about it yet, they were being told to turn to the teacher and talk about it with the teacher. The teacher would start calling you the pronouns, and anything that you couldn't talk about with your parents because you hadn't come out as whatever it may be, you could talk to the teacher about it. You could talk to someone else who's an adult privately about things of that nature. Same thing in Canada. It's very interesting. Why are these same things happening everywhere? Now, Glenn Greenwald has a great insight into why these things are happening at the same time throughout the world. Very, very interesting. Let's switch over to him.
My last question. Do you think the authoritarianism that's obviously descending on the world, is it a permanent state? Is this accelerating? Or is this just a sort of an interlude that we're going to laugh about ruefully in 10 years?
Well, this is what the point I always make, because I talk a lot about on my show, which primarily has an American audience, about what's happening in Brazil. And I stress the reason they should care isn't just because Brazil is this very large country with huge resources and a lot of importance on the geopolitical stage, the second largest in our hemisphere, which would be reason enough. It's because the United States is on exactly the same trajectory, maybe just a couple steps behind. And what all of these countries in the democratic world are doing in Western Europe, in Canada, I was just in Canada because there's this shockingly repressive law that provides for prison sentences for hate speech on the internet. Prison sentences.
Up to 7 years.
Yeah. And actually, if you're accused of inciting or defending genocide, you can be put into prison for life under this bill. I mean, this bill is shocking. I went to Canada to do events against the censorship law, not because I'm Canadian or care about Canada, but because what's happening is every one of these countries is using the other as a laboratory for how far they can go. So every time one country takes another step toward consolidating control over the internet and what can and can't be said, that shows other countries the space that they now have to go forward as well. It's completely interconnected. Every time the EU or the UK or Ireland or Canada or Brazil take steps forward to consolidate censorship control over the internet,
The norms change.
Exactly. And it completely transforms what the population comes to think is normal.
Again, though, is it inexorable, this move toward 1984?
The internet is such a fascinating innovation because it has such a dual edge potential. On the one hand, it can be this unique and unprecedented tool of emancipation and liberation that was its promise and potential. On the other hand, it can also be a tool of unprecedented coercion and control, because if it is no longer free, if it can be used as a method of ubiquitous surveillance and information control, I think it can become a closed system that is almost impossible to work your way out of. And that's why, to me, there is no more important battle than keeping the internet free in terms of privacy and free in terms of speech, because it is increasingly the only way that we really communicate and spread ideas with one another.
Does AI technology make that?
Exactly. And it completely transforms what the population comes to think is normal.
Again, though, is it inexorable, this move?
I wanted to stop there anyway. I don't know why it just did that. Right as they're talking about a free internet, gets a little reset there. Okay. No problem. I hear you, YouTube. But exactly what he was saying, and I just want him to repeat that again, because you have to remember that as you're talking. Now, I've talked about this before. I've done videos on Brazil, and the thing that I said was exactly that. The reason that I'm showing everybody what's happening in Brazil with Twitter and what they're demanding, what they're doing to journalists, is because we're just steps behind. You know? It's like so many times you'll hear Joe Rogan talk about Canada. He'll be like, oh, communist Canada. But then also he'll talk about communist California. It's like those places are ways away, but they're showing the signs of the same thing, which means that Canada is getting swept through and through. Alberta's resisting a little bit. Where the farmers are, where the real hardworking people are, they're resisting a bit. But it is sweeping through the whole wokeness, the whole regime. America, same thing. There's a lot of places that are holding strong. You know, Florida has become a Republican stronghold, and law and order is really something that DeSantis is taking really seriously. But places in California, New York, Chicago, not so much. It's starting to change, but you know what I mean? Like, steps behind. When you look at these things, just steps behind. One thing happened. It was the World Economic Forum. It wasn't 2024. It was 2023. Brian Stelter was hosting a panel for misinformation and disinformation. There was 4 people on this panel. There was one American. There was one woman from the UK. She was talking about the hate speech laws that Glenn Greenwald was just bringing up. And she was talking about how they're implemented and what they're about. And then she touches the American guy's leg and says, don't worry, you'll have those laws soon enough as well. And the American guy was he didn't really like what she was saying. He didn't fight back when she touched him and everything like that. But he was like, oh yeah? But it's like, oh yeah, that is going to happen. You know, as much as it seems needed, what just happened in Texas with Greg Abbott passing this law where there's going to be zero tolerance towards anti-Semitism, great for the students that didn't feel safe on these campuses. Not good for freedom of speech as a whole. Matt Walsh did a big piece on it. Steps behind. Just steps behind. I just want Glenn Greenwald to say this one more time.
Internet and what can and can't be said, that shows other countries the space that they now have to go forward as well. It's completely interconnected. Every time the EU or the UK or Ireland or Canada or Brazil take steps forward to consolidate censorship control over the internet,
The norms change.
Exactly. And it completely transforms what the population comes to think is normal.
It's really true. And then when we talk about these laws that they're talking about, right? I just jumped in real quick just to see, like, how does Canada's hate speech laws work, right? So it's like criminal code. Here's the thing that stood out to me. Section 319 makes it an offense to publish or distribute hate propaganda, including written or printed materials, audio or visual recordings or broadcastings that promote hatred against any identifiable group. Here's the thing. Who decides what the hate is? What they're doing, because it's a little vague, that could be a troll. There could be a troll who's making fun of a group. That group that he's making fun of could be the government, and that could be taken as an offense. Again, Jordan Peterson was on Joe Rogan's podcast, said a bunch of things about the Canadian government, and then they pushed him to get re-education, social media re-education, which if he didn't agree to, his license as a psychologist would be taken away. Which, if I was him, I would just step away from that. Like, I'm sure you could get one in America, no problem. You know what I mean? Like, what are we talking about here? Then I stepped over to Australia, how the hate speech crimes work there. Hate speech laws in Australia aim to prohibit or prevent discrimination, vilification, incitement to hatred, or violence against individuals or groups based on certain characteristics: race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. Here's the thing. Again, it goes back to exactly what Canada was saying. Hatred. It could be hatred. What is deemed hatred? If you dislike what a group is doing, and now you're saying something about them, is that now hatred? It's a very slippery slope. And then you get to the UK, and there's been people, countless people. I believe the number is about 3,400 people who have been jailed over tweets. And these are just cases. This has been happening. Look at this. 2010. He was arrested and charged under Section 127 of the Communications Act for tweeting a joke about blowing up an airport. Might be a little bit much, right? But then 2011, somebody's put in jail for 12 weeks for tweeting at feminist writer Caroline and Labour MP Stella, who were campaigning for UK's next $10 banknote to feature a woman. So somebody said something to them. 2022, found guilty of sending grossly offensive tweet to Captain Sir Moore, a British Army officer. Sorry, you guys can't see that. My bad. I'm just reading off the other side. Sorry about that. But you see what's happening here? A lot of people are getting jailed. They're tweeting at people who are in positions of power. They're getting jailed. This is in the UK, of course. But again, exactly to what we were talking about, just steps behind. This person was jailed for 6 weeks for sending racist tweets to England footballer Marcus following the 2020 Euro finals. So that person got jailed for sending a racist tweet. How racist was it? I don't know. Who deems what's racist? You say something that's a little unpolitically correct, and the next thing you know, you're deemed as a racist. How many times have so many things that don't seem racist been deemed racist? Now, all of a sudden, a law like that passes in America. Now, what are you looking at? Are people going back into your tweets, back to 2010, when you said certain things that are okay? Right now, in America, that exists, but it exists in the form of cancellations. Right? Somebody goes back, right? Rogan's whole thing, they went back on Rogan. They went all the way back to all the things he said. Every time he said a certain word, and then they made a compilation. They're like, here you go. Now, in another place, he could have went to jail possibly. They could have been like, that was extremely offensive, grossly offensive. It's against this group. It shows hatred. You're going to jail for 12 weeks. It's wild. But I only show these to show that this is Canada that I'm bringing up, then Australia, then the UK, places that are ways away. But again, steps behind. And then, I'm not even going to Whatever, I can play this video.
And why won't you show me your credentials?
So this is a woman who is standing in front of some FBI agents. They're claiming that they're FBI agents. They're saying that they've identified themselves. All they want to do is talk to this woman about her tweets, about her social media. So she's resisting a little bit.
That's correct. What we'd like to do is just have a conversation with you about some social media posts that you've made. Would you be willing to talk to us today about that?
No, I would not. I would like you to later talk on with my lawyer.
A lot of these people are just saying, talk to my lawyer. This is not the first time this has happened. This is another time that it happened where some guys came by. Luckily, the person had one of those ring systems set up so they could see them without having to actually open the door. This one's not loading for some reason, but this gentleman does have the exact same situation going on. These gentlemen identify themselves as someone who works for an agency. They want to talk to him about his social media, and there's been a whole rash of that going on. So I just wanted to bring that up. It's just really interesting, the two men's takes. One is saying it's no coincidence. And the other one, Glenn Greenwald, I really think he's right about that. They look at it as a testing ground. They say, look what they just did in Canada. Let's try that here. Look what they just, and I think I see how it's happening. It seems like it's going, look what they did in the UK. We can do that here. And that's Canada saying that. And then the US looks at Canada and says, look what they just did over there. I think we can slowly implement something like that too. And again, in my mind, it all works lockstep with Agenda 2030, but who knows? But also, it's definitely no coincidence. So just wanted to bring that up. I thought that was very interesting. Again, Glenn Greenwald, Neil Oliver, listen to those two interviews. They're talking about some really impactful stuff. Like this episode, subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, helps tremendously. Other than that, I'm out.